Relax, she doesn't do anything anyway. That's how it started. Not with a fight, not with a secret being exposed, not even with anger. Just a joke, the kind people laugh at without thinking. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. So, let me ask you, what would you do if the person sitting next to you, the one who's supposed to know you best, casually erased you in front of a room full of strangers? Would you correct them? Would you laugh it off? Or would you stay quiet and let it unfold? Because Mira Voss chose the third option, and that's why everything that happened next hit so much harder. The dining room glowed under soft golden light, reflecting off polished glass and silverware. Conversations overlapped, wine flowed freely, and every voice carried that subtle edge of performance, the kind people use when they're trying to impress. This wasn't just dinner. This was a celebration, a high-stakes one. Mira sat halfway down the table, posture straight, expression calm. At 24, she had a kind of presence people didn't immediately understand. Quiet, observant, almost unreadable. Next to her, her husband, Daniel Voss, 31, was the opposite. Confident, charismatic, effortlessly loud. The kind of man who didn't just enter rooms, he took ownership of them. Tonight, that confidence made sense. After months of chasing it, Daniel had finally secured a major client, Victor Hale. If you knew anything about business, that name carried weight. Victor wasn't just wealthy, he was selective. Difficult. I'd known for walking away from deals over details most people didn't even notice. And tonight, he was here, at the table, smiling, which meant Daniel had done something right. Or at least, that's what everyone thought. The laughter peaked right before the moment. Someone had asked Mira a simple question, one of those polite, surface-level ones people throw into conversations when they don't know what else to say. "So, Mira, what do you do?" Daniel didn't even let her answer. He leaned back, grinning, swirling his drink like he'd been waiting for this. "She doesn't do anything," he said casually. "No deadlines, no pressure. Honestly, she's got the easiest life at this table." A few chuckles, a couple polite smiles. Someone nodded like that made perfect sense, and just like that, her identity was reduced to a punchline. Mira didn't react. Not outwardly. She lifted her glass, took a small sip, and set it back down with controlled precision. Her face stayed composed. No embarrassment, no irritation, nothing to signal discomfort. But her fingers tightened just slightly around the stem. Barely noticeable. Unless you were really paying attention. And someone was. Across the table, Victor Hale had gone quiet. Not dramatically. Not enough for everyone to notice. But enough. His gaze shifted. Not to Daniel, not to the others, but directly to Mira. And it lingered. Not with curiosity, with recognition. Here's the part no one at that table understood yet. Mira Voss did have a job. A very real one. A very specific one. And if even one person at that table connected the dots, everything Daniel had built his confidence on tonight would start to crack. Because some work doesn't need attention. Some work speaks for itself. And sometimes, it speaks at the worst possible moment. The conversation moved on, as it always does. Business, numbers, growth projections. Daniel slipped right back into control, explaining strategies, outlining success, owning the room again like nothing had happened. But Mira noticed things, small things. Victor barely touched his wine. He asked sharper questions than before, and every so often, his eyes flicked back to her, like he was waiting for confirmation, or maybe for a mistake. Then it happened. Victor leaned forward slightly, placing his glass down with deliberate care. The conversation thinned. I not silent, but quieter, focused, and then calmly, almost casually, he asked, "So, what do you do?" This time, Daniel didn't answer immediately. He smiled, ready to jump in again. But something about Victor's tone made him hesitate. Just for a second. And in that second, Mira spoke. One word, simple, unimpressive. But the moment it left her lips, Victor froze, and Daniel's smile started to slip. Contracts. That was the word. Not flashy, not impressive. Not the kind of answer that turns heads at a dinner table full of executives. If anything, it should have passed right through the conversation unnoticed. But it didn't. Because the second Mira said it, Victor Hale stopped moving. Not dramatically, not in a way that drew immediate attention, but if you were watching closely, you would have seen it. The pause. And the stillness. The way his fingers hovered just above the table, like his body needed a second to catch up with what he'd just heard. Daniel didn't notice. He laughed. Of course he did. A quick, easy laugh, the kind meant to smooth things over. Yeah, he said, waving his hand slightly. She means like small freelance stuff. Templates, basic agreements, nothing too serious. A few people nodded. That made sense to them. It fit the version of Mira they had already accepted. Simple. Light. Uninvolved. Conversation ready to move on. But Victor didn't move on. His eyes stayed on Mira. Sharp now, focused, and just beneath that calm expression, something else was forming. Recognition. Let's rewind for a second. 2 years earlier, a small apartment, quiet, late at night. Mira sat cross-legged on the floor, laptop open, a document scattered around her. Not messy, organized chaos. Every file labeled, every clause intentional. While most people her age were trying to figure out what they wanted to do, Mira had already figured out what she was good at. Not networking, not presenting, not selling ideas in crowded rooms. She understood structure, precision, the invisible framework behind agreements that either held or collapsed. Contracts, but not the kind people downloaded from the internet. Mira built contracts like systems, layered protections, hidden contingencies, clauses that anticipated problems before they existed. If something could go wrong, she planned for it. If someone tried to exploit a loophole, she closed it before it opened. Her work didn't look impressive on the surface, but it made everything else work. Yet there was just one detail she kept deliberately quiet. She didn't use her full name, not publicly, not professionally. Instead, her work moved under a subtle identity. M. Voss Consulting. No face, no personal branding, no social presence, just results. And in certain circles, that name carried weight. Back then, she had tried to explain it to Daniel. Once, maybe twice. Sitting across from him, walking him through what she did. Risk layers, enforcement triggers, negotiation positioning. He listened, nodded, then checked his phone, changed the subject, asked if she could send him something simple he could use for a client. After that, she stopped explaining. Not out of anger, just efficiency. Why spend time describing something to someone who already decided it didn't matter? Back to the present, the table, and the silence. Victor finally leaned back slightly, studying her like he was aligning two separate pieces of information. What kind of contracts? He asked, still calm, still controlled, but now intentional. Daniel jumped in again. Like I said, small-scale stuff. She keeps things low pressure. There it was again. That quiet dismissal, wrapped in a compliment. Mira didn't look at Daniel, didn't correct him, didn't react at all. She just met Victor's gaze and answered, structured agreements, mostly high-risk negotiations. That didn't fit the narrative, not even a little. A few people at the table shifted slightly. Someone raised an eyebrow. Daniel smiled, but tighter this time, like the conversation was starting to slip somewhere he didn't fully control. Victor's expression didn't change much, but his next question did. Interesting, he said slowly. Because the contract I signed this morning? He paused, just long enough for the tension to settle in. Was anything but low pressure. Now the table was paying attention. Fully. No more side conversations, no more background noise. Daniel let out a small laugh again, but this one didn't land the same. Coincidence? Probably, he said. But even he didn't sound fully convinced. Victor didn't respond to Daniel. He was still looking at Mira. And now, he was certain, because there was only one person who structured contracts the way that one was written. Only one signature style that precise, that controlled, that intentional. And for the first time that night, the power at the table shifted, slightly, but enough. Victor leaned forward and said a name, quietly, clearly. Have you ever heard of Monsieur Voss? Daniel's smile froze. Mira didn't blink, and the room held its breath. Have you ever heard of Monsieur Voss? The name didn't hit the table loudly, it didn't need to. Because the moment Victor said it, everything shifted. Not visibly, not all at once, but you could feel it. Like the air pressure in the room had changed. Daniel blinked. Once. Twice. A small crease formed between his brows, confusion trying to pass as indifference. Monsieur Voss? He repeated, letting out a short chuckle. Can't say I have. Too quick, too dismissive. The kind of answer people give when they don't realize they're already behind. Victor didn't react to him, didn't even acknowledge the response. His attention stayed exactly where it had been, on Mira, steady, focused, waiting. So let's pause for a second, because this is the moment where everything starts to come apart, not because of what's said, but because of what's already been done. Earlier that morning, Victor Hale had reviewed a contract unlike anything he'd seen in years. Not because it was flashy, not because it was complicated for the sake of being complicated, but because it was controlled. Every clause connected, every risk accounted for, every potential loophole quietly sealed before it could exist. It wasn't just a contract, it was a system. And Victor had seen enough of them in his career to recognize a pattern, a signature, not written in ink, but in structure. At the bottom of that contract, there was a name. Small, almost forgettable, M. Voss Consulting. He had asked about it, briefly. Daniel's team had brushed it off. External consultant. Nothing major. Just support work. Victor didn't push. Not then. Because he didn't need to. He preferred confirmation over explanation. And tonight, he got it. Back at the table, Mira finally spoke. Yes, she said calmly. I've heard of it. No hesitation, no performance, just acknowledgement. Daniel glanced at her now, really looked at her. For the first time that evening, something didn't line up. But instead of following that instinct, he overcorrected. Oh, come on, he said lightly, trying to regain control of the room. We're really doing this? It's just a name. Probably some overhyped consultant. A couple of uneasy laughs followed, but they were weaker now, uncertain, because Victor still wasn't laughing. Instead, he reached down beside his chair, picked up a slim leather folder, and placed it on the table. Slowly, deliberately. You know that feeling when something is about to happen, and everyone senses it at the same time? That was this moment. Conversations died completely. Glasses stopped midair. Even the ambient noise of the restaurant seemed to fade behind the tension gathering at that table. Victor opened the folder, pulled out a printed document, and slid it across the table. Not to Daniel, to Mira. Would you mind, he said evenly, walking us through Clause 14b? Daniel's stomach dropped. He didn't show it, but it hit him because he remembered that clause. Vaguely, complicated wording. Something about layered contingencies. He had skimmed it, trusted it, moved on. Mira didn't touch the document right away. She didn't need to. Her eyes flicked down once, then back up. And she spoke. Clause 14. B establishes a conditional risk transfer, she began, her voice steady, clear. It activates only if the secondary party attempts early exit under subsection C. No notes, no hesitation, a pause. Then she continued, and 14C prevents exploitation of that exit by embedding a financial deterrent tied to projected quarterly loss, not current valuation. Victor leaned back slightly, watching, listening, measuring. Mira added one more line. Calm, precise. The structure closes the loophole you mentioned during preliminary negotiations. And that's when it broke, because Daniel's expression changed. Not subtly, not this time. His eyes widened, just slightly, then narrowed, then stilled. Because that detail, that specific loophole, he had only mentioned it once, in private, late at night, eyeing casually, to Mira. No one else knew, not his team, not his colleagues, not even Victor. And yet, it was in the contract, solved, perfectly. The silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was heavy, undeniable. Victor closed the folder, slowly, satisfied. Daniel turned to Mira, voice lower now, careful, controlled. You Wrote this? Mira met his eyes. No tension, no emotion breaking through, just truth. Yes. And in that single word, everything Daniel thought he understood collapsed. You wrote this? The question didn't sound like Daniel, not the version of him everyone at the table had been watching all night. There was no charm in it, no smooth confidence, just something quieter, unsteady. Mira didn't rush to fill the silence. She didn't soften the moment, didn't explain. And she simply held his gaze and answered, yes. That word didn't echo. It settled, heavy, final, like a door closing somewhere Daniel hadn't realized was open. Now let me ask you something. What happens when someone's entire perception of reality shifts in public? Do they accept it? Or do they try to fight it? Daniel didn't fight. Not immediately. He just stared at her, searching, replaying every conversation they'd ever had. Every time she said she was working. Every time he didn't ask what on. Every time he assumed. And suddenly, those moments weren't small anymore. They were evidence. Victor broke the silence. I thought so, he said calmly, folding his hands on the table. There's a consistency in your work, hard to miss once you've seen it. Not praise, not flattery, just acknowledgement. And the rest of the table didn't know where to look. A few minutes ago, Mira had been invisible. Now, she was the center of gravity. And Daniel, for the first time that night, he wasn't. I requested Monsieur Voss for this deal, Victor continued. That landed harder than anything else, because it reframed everything. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a coincidence. This was intentional. Daniel frowned slightly. That wasn't in the brief, he said, almost instinctively. Victor tilted his head. It was in the final revision your team approved. And there it was. The detail Daniel skipped. The document he didn't fully read. The assumption he didn't question. Because he didn't think he had to. A quiet ripple moved through the table. Not loud, but noticeable. People connecting dots. Reevaluating everything they'd heard earlier. Especially that line, she doesn't do anything. Mira sat still. No shift in posture. No visible reaction to the attention. But internally, this wasn't new. This wasn't surprising. This was expected. Not planned, not orchestrated. Just inevitable. Victor glanced between them, then said something that changed the stakes completely. I assume you'll want to renegotiate attribution before we proceed further? That sentence didn't sound aggressive, but it carried weight, real weight, because now this wasn't about perception anymore. It was about ownership, credit, authority, and suddenly, the room wasn't just watching a personal moment unfold. They were watching a professional shift, in real time. Daniel leaned back slightly, exhaling through his nose. Processing. Calculating. Trying to find stable ground again. We're a team, he said finally, his voice measured. So I don't think attribution is an issue. It sounded reasonable, on the surface. But Victor didn't nod, didn't agree, didn't even look convinced. Instead, he turned back to Mira, directly. Did you sign the contract? Simple question, clear answer. Mira didn't hesitate. Yes. Another pause. Then Victor gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. I thought so, he said. And just like that, the balance of power at the table shifted completely. Not gradually, not subtly. Completely. Because in that moment, everyone understood the same thing. The deal Daniel had been celebrating was never fully his. And now, the question wasn't whether Mira had written the contract. That part was already clear. And the real question was, what happens next? Did you sign the contract? Victor's question lingered for half a second longer than it should have. Not because it was unclear, but because everyone at the table already knew the answer. Mira gave it anyway. Yes. That single word did what no explanation could. It clarified everything. Clean, precise, final. Victor nodded once as if confirming a detail he had already verified long before this dinner even started. I thought so, he said. Then calmly, almost casually, he added, I don't move forward on deals unless I know exactly who I'm dealing with. Let that sink in. This wasn't a discovery, it was a confirmation. Victor hadn't just recognized Mira's work, he had planned around it. Earlier that week, when Daniel's firm submitted their proposal, and Victor had noticed something off. Not wrong, just different, sharper, more controlled. The contract structure wasn't typical of Daniel's team, it was tighter, smarter, anticipatory. So Victor did what experienced people do. He looked deeper. Buried in the documentation, attached to a revision most people would skim, was the name M. Voss Consulting. Small, unassuming, easy to overlook. Unless you knew what you were looking for, Victor did, because he had encountered that name before. Twice. Both times tied to deals that didn't just succeed. They held. No disputes, no renegotiations, no hidden failures months later. So, he made a decision. He didn't question Daniel's team. He didn't ask for clarification. He simply ensured one thing, that MC Voss would be present when it mattered. Tonight wasn't just a dinner. It was a test. Back at the table, Daniel shifted slightly in his seat. Not dramatically, but enough to show the pressure building under the surface. "This is great," he said, forcing a controlled smile. "Like I said, we're a team." Victor didn't interrupt this time. He just watched. Daniel continued, trying to stabilize the situation. "So, attribution doesn't really need to be—" "No," Victor said, cutting in gently but firmly, not aggressive, not loud, but absolute. "I don't do vague teams." Silence, again. But this time, it wasn't uncertain. It was decisive. Victor turned to Mira. "Going forward," he said, "I want all contract structuring handled directly through you." There it was. Clear, public, unavoidable. The shift wasn't subtle anymore. It was official. The truth, Ari laid out without confusion. Mira had been operating under Monsieur Voss Consulting for over 2 years. She had built a reputation quietly, through results, not visibility. Daniel's firm had unknowingly relied on her expertise for their most critical deal. Victor identified her work instantly and structured the entire evening to confirm it. The coincidence was never a coincidence. Every piece now fit. Every earlier moment made sense. Daniel looked at Mira again, but this time, there was no performance left, no charm, no control, just realization. "You never told me," he said quietly. And this is where everything could have turned emotional, explosive, messy. But Mira didn't raise her voice, didn't lean into the moment, didn't need to. "You never asked," she said. No anger, no accusation, just truth. And somehow, that landed harder than anything else that had been said all night. Because it wasn't about one dinner or one contract. It was about every moment before this one, every assumption, every dismissal, every time she was reduced to something smaller because it was easier. And now, that version of her didn't exist anymore. The dinner didn't recover. It didn't collapse either. It just changed. The people at the table adjusted quickly, like people do when power shifts in front of them. The same clients who laughed earlier now directed questions to Mira. One of Daniel's colleagues asked quietly if she was taking new clients. Conversations repositioned themselves around her expertise. Daniel stayed quieter. Not silent, but careful, measured, because the room no longer responded to him the same way. Unprofessional consequences. Within a week, Victor amended the contract formally, listing Mira Voss as lead architect. Future negotiations were routed through her directly. Mira began receiving inquiries, real ones from high-level clients. Her name was no longer hidden, and her work didn't need to be explained anymore. Relational consequences. That night, after they got home, there was no argument, no shouting, no dramatic confrontation, just silence. Daniel sat across from her in their apartment, elbows resting on his knees. For once, he didn't try to fill the space. "I thought I knew everything about you," he said. Mira took a moment before answering. Not because she didn't have a response, but because she chose her words carefully. "There was space to know," she said. "You just didn't use it." Again, no anger, just clarity. And that made it impossible to deflect. Over the next few weeks, things didn't fall apart. But they didn't stay the same either. Daniel stopped speaking for her in public, stopped filling in answers she hadn't given, stopped assuming, not out of guilt, but because now he knew better. A month later, another meeting, another table. But this time, Mira sat at the head. No introductions needed, no explanations offered. Victor sat across from her again, reviewing documents she had prepared. Different setting, different dynamic, same precision. As the meeting wrapped up, Victor closed the folder and looked at her. "I'm glad you decided to step forward," he said. Mira held his gaze for a moment, then replied, calm and certain, "I didn't step forward." A slight pause. "I just stopped stepping back." And that was the difference. Not a transformation, not a sudden rise, just the removal of something that had been holding her in place. Final image, a later event, another room, another gathering. Daniel stands across the space watching, not speaking over her, not introducing her incorrectly, not shaping the narrative, just watching. Understanding, finally, who his wife really was, and who she had been the entire time.